So, I'll ask Paul to give us the lecture. Welcome particularly to all of you from outside of AUT. We're also on live stream, so if you're sitting around the world, welcome to Paul Moon.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thank you, David, too. As you can see, the topic of this lecture is a history of te reo in the 19th century, and in some respects the 19th century is very much an arbitrary period. It's just a decimal detail, really, because you can't tear out a single period from the fabric of history and examine it in isolation. You're going to end up with frayed edges both before and afterwards. But in this case, the 19th century happens to be a very useful period of analysis because it encompasses the point, not that useful, it encompasses the point from 1800 where the language was not just the dominant but the only language spoken in the country, through to 1899 where it was spoken by about 2 or 3% of the population. So it's a staggering period of transition in just one century. It's also the history of two languages, really. It's the history of te reo, but it's also the history of English and the effect and impact that English had on te reo. And it's also a history of literacy. And so literacy and English and te reo mix up in this often confused concoction, and the results tend to be quite damaging for te reo over the whole of the century, and it tends to accelerate in damage towards the end of the century. It's important to note, though, that there wasn't a single policy in the 19th century by successive governments to ban the language. There was never a blanket policy that we want to ban the language. And the best illustration, I think, of this point was made in 1985 when Sir James Henare was testifying before the Waitangi Tribunal. And the tribunal said to him, "What about this policy?" There was none. There was no intention to ban the language. There wasn't a law passed to ban it everywhere and so on. And Sir James replied, and it's a very instructive reply, he said, there wasn't a policy, but there was, his words, an extremely effective gentleman's agreement. And that sums up perfectly how it operated. And you can see the fingerprints of that agreement throughout the 19th century, that behind the scenes, politicians, officials, and others are working to push te reo into the periphery and perhaps off the edge altogether. That was certainly the ambition of some people. So I won't be pointing out that there was this particular law passed that banned the language in the 19th century because there's no such law. And not because politicians were somehow sympathetic towards te reo, on the contrary, most of them were keen to get rid of the language altogether, but because they realised there were far better means of getting rid of the language rather than legislation. And there's possibly a lesson there that when we look at reviving the language, legislation also may be a fairly blunt instrument to deal with it. Okay, so what was the situation in 1800? Well, in some senses, we know a lot about how te reo was in the 1800s. In other senses, we know very little. So it's an element of a bit of knowledge and a bit of reconstruction that goes into it. The first point, obviously, is that it was completely an oral language, and most people realise that. But as far as the vast majority of Māori were concerned in the beginning of the 19th century, it was the only language. They'd never seen a Pākehā, they'd never heard any other language. One or two had, but the vast majority hadn't. So it wasn't just a language, it was the language, literally the universal language, the language that the gods spoke. There was no conception of there being any other language. And being an oral language had some quite important implications for the society, because the people who held the knowledge, who transmitted it, people they transmitted it to and so on, had an effect on the social structure. So language was far more influential on social structure then than perhaps it is today, because it was people who were the repositories of knowledge and who used language to transfer that knowledge. In one respect only, and please don't take this the wrong way, it was a very weak language. And what I mean by that is it hadn't developed the mechanisms to protect itself from the threats posed by other languages in the way that European languages had. European languages over centuries had evolved in social and cultural ways to protect themselves, to shield their languages from neighbouring languages. Te reo had no need for that. The analogy read is like the Kiwi. When millions of years ago, when New Zealand separated from Australia, the Kiwi at one stage could fly, but it eventually lost its ability to fly because there were no predators. And the same thing happened in a way with te reo, that it lost any need to defend itself from other languages because there were no linguistic predators. So in the early decades of the 19th century, particularly in the 20s and 30s, it was very vulnerable to attack from other languages, simply because it hadn't developed those mechanisms. There were other aspects of the language that perhaps we don't always appreciate. For example, that it was regarded as a conduit or a bridge that connected the physical world with the spiritual world. That if you wanted to get into that spiritual world, language was the means to do it. So it's very important in that respect. There are other metaphysical or spiritual aspects of it as well. The idea that when you hongi with someone, when you press your nose with someone else, that the breath that comes out of your nose, that Māori that's contained in your breath, mingles with the breath of the nose of it coming out from the other person's nose, and there's a connection made between people in that way. And speaking te reo also involved exhaling breath, and also involved your Māori being sent out into the world, as it were. And so there was a symbiotic relationship that developed between the person speaking and the person listening. And language was, in a way, treasured as something that was almost spiritual. It was at times, in certain cases anyway, a fairly idiomatic language. If you look at a compound word in English like cupboard, what does it mean? Well, it comes from cup and board, cup, board, cupboard. It's a board that you put cups on. You can derive the meaning from its constituent parts. If you look at a word like waimumu, on the other hand, what does that mean? Wai, water, mumu, a class of warrior. A water warrior, is it a warrior who paddles a canoe? No, it's actually a place. Waimumu describes a place where warriors rest and recuperate before or after a battle. And you won't know that by the constituent parts of the word itself. You have to actually have some sort of cultural background in it. So a lot of the language was tied up with the way you were brought up and the way the words were used. They didn't necessarily mean literally what they said. And of course, I'm sure you're all familiar, there were words that were tapu that only a few people in the community could speak, and only a few people in the community could even hear. And there were also, I think every hapu and iwi but just about has an oral history of someone uttering a curse at some point and a war erupting as a result. And so words were enormously powerful. But really, the greatest power, I think, in the language in 1800 was in the formal oratory that took place. And I think some people pay a bit of lip service to this. They say, oh, Māori were great orators, as though it's just a standard thing that you say. But in fact, the oratory was truly great. Truly it was very highly nuanced, and it relied on a lot of experience on behalf of the speakers. The way you spoke could establish your intellectual credentials, your leadership credentials. It could affect the mana of the audience. And there was a whole world of language to draw on. There was allusion, similes, spiritual content, historical content, all these things with a skull beneath the skin. They were the things that propped up these formal addresses. There's a fair amount of research on speaking, but there's less research, much less research on the other thing, which is the culture of listening. That there was a particular way that audiences listened, and audiences very trained, not just at listening, but interpreting what was saying. And there's an example, this one actually quite recent, but it's a traditional type example. This goes back to 1985 also, to a hui that the government convened. The new Labour government was elected the previous year. And there were iwi leaders from all over the country at this hui. And it's no surprise really that after a short while, some of those old tribal divisions, those old chauvinisms began to belch to the surface really. And it was causing quite a bit of friction. So the chairman, Oratory, said, look, what do we do to achieve Māori unity? How do we achieve it? And most of those iwi leaders there looked at the ground and sort of just mumbled a bit and shuffled and didn't say anything. And one person stood up. His name was Hoepa Kiriopa. He was a tohunga from Tūhoi, and he said, we shoot John Rangiho. That was a bit strange. In fact, people weren't quite sure what he said. So Koroweteri asked the question again. He said, no, how do we achieve unity in this hui? How do we achieve unity among us all? And Hoepa stood up again and he said, it's simple. We shoot John Rangiho and we kill him. And he sat down and didn't say anything for the rest of the meeting. Now, if that was a Pākehā audience, and I'm just guessing at this, they might say, well, poor man, he's forgotten his medication or something. It's an odd thing to say. But the culture of listening was very much alive at that hui, and those leaders from those various hapu and iwi understood the message, and it was this. If John Rangiho was shot and killed, there would be a tangi, and there'd be a huge outpouring of grief because he was one of those men who was a great repository of the culture and language. And that sense of grief would be almost overwhelming, and it would dissolve all the sorts of divisions that were occurring at this hui. And the message was we need to have that sort of thinking. The sort of thinking we have at a tangi is the sort of thinking we need at this hui because our culture, and particularly our language, is also on the verge of dying. So that's the type of approach we need. Now, Hoepa never explained any of this. He relied on that culture of the listener in order to, hopefully, get the message across. Hoepa was a tohunga, and there's another compound word there. It comes from two words, whakatō and huna. Whakatō means to plant and huna to hide. That's where we get tohunga from. And that's a particular method of speaking in this case, which relates to that concept, that you plant an idea, but you don't explain it. In this case, he sat down effectively, he hid. And so again, there were particular roles in traditional Māori society, had particular types of speaking attached to them in some instances. And there's a sort of postscript to that a few years later, Hoepa found out that John Rangiho was his biological father. A small world. But all this isolation, if it was glorious or otherwise, couldn't really survive. At some point, New Zealand was bound to join the rest of the world, or the rest of the world was bound to entangle itself in New Zealand. And the first point at which literacy hit New Zealand was in 1642, when Tasman arrived here, and one of his cartographers on the ships, Franz Vischer, produced a brief outline of the country and gave it some names. Ranganui Walker has said that missionaries were the advance guard of colonisation, but I think we can go one step further and say that even before the first Europeans arrived or set foot in the country, text was the first act of colonisation, the act of displacing indigenous names and putting European ones in their place. So, as far as the map itself is concerned, it's not particularly remarkable, but symbolically it's of huge importance. It made its way back to the Dutch East Indies Company, where it stayed in the archives for a few decades. Then it was part of Tasman's journal. It was translated into English. It was published in England. In fact, Cook makes reference to Tasman's journal and the map in his first expedition to New Zealand in 1769. And it tells us a bit about the difference that was just becoming apparent, perhaps, to a few people at this time between oral cultures and literate cultures. Because in literate cultures, things like maps, things like text were transportable, they were translatable, they were completely impersonal, they were immune to the fickleness of human memory, and they could outlive the creator. So they had a life all of their own. And these are quite different aspects of language from a purely oral culture. The other point about this map is that it's part of the process of Europe textualizing the world. What that means essentially is that Europe gave meaning to the world through adding names to it. In fact, the world didn't have any meaning unless European names were given to it. And so it's this active linguistic colonization that just keeps rolling on with greater speed by the end of the 18th century. And it happened partly because there was a belief that Māori really weren't that knowledgeable, and certainly their language was primitive. This was a common belief that lasted from the 17th century right through into the early 20th century, that it's not a great language. It's, in fact, one of the crewmen on Cook's last tours to New Zealand, 1776, on the Resolution, one of the crewmen described the language as degenerate and deficient. It's a deficient language. And he knew this crewman knew this because he produced a dictionary. It was a dictionary of 26 words, and on that basis he thought, well, it's a deficient language. And this is the sort of comment that was easily made because everyone instinctively knew it. Well, it's an indigenous language, it's not English, it's somehow inferior. The truth, of course, is quite different, and there are occasional glimmers of what the truth was. In 1834, Baron Charles von Hugel, who was a botanist, was travelling through Northland, and he arrived at the Waimate North mission station, which was run by the Reverend William Yate. Yate was a reasonably fluent Te Reo speaker. And this botanist, von Hugel, had collected a huge quantity of plant specimens. He was planning to build this big garden in Vienna eventually. And one night he was sitting down talking with Yate, and he said to Yate, I wonder if the natives have any idea of the names of these plants. And Yate said, well, we'll find out. So he called over a local Māori and said, look, could you tell us the names of these plants? Von Hugel got his pencil out and wrote them down. He wrote 300 names of the plant varieties and parts of the plants. Now, I challenge any of you to go into the forest and come up with 300 separate names. That's a huge accomplishment. And both Yate and von Hugel were astonished by this. Although later on they thought, well, perhaps this guy's having us on. You know, a couple of Europeans are a bit more gullible, and he thought it was. So it occurred to them. So the next night they tried it again. They just got some other person from the local Māori community, at random apparently, called him over and said, can you give us the names of these plants? And now they were able to cross-reference it with what the previous night's person the previous night had said. And here's what Yeats wrote in his diary. He said, with one single exception, out of 300 specimens, the second Māori gave the same name as each as had been given the night before. So he got 299 out of 300 right. It's an astonishing accomplishment for two men apparently picked at random. And so Yeats took this as a cue to expand a bit more about the language. He said, I never found a native at a loss to express any of the passions, feelings, sensations, anything that could be connected with sorrow, joy, good, evil. In short, there is scarcely anything in which we can imagine, but they have an expression for it. So it's a fairly positive view of te reo, that it was the equivalent of any other language, but it's very much a minority view. Most Europeans either dismissed the language or they didn't understand it. Some made the effort to understand it. Philip King is a good example, the Lieutenant Governor who was based in Norfolk Island in the 1790s. He produced a dictionary of te reo, which at the time was the biggest that had existed. It was about 200 words. And how it came about was in 1793, he had been responsible for developing the flax processing industry in Norfolk Island. And if you were anywhere in the world in the 1790s and you wanted expertise on flax processing, you got someone from New Zealand to help you. There happened to be two Māori on a ship who had dropped some flax off, and they'd learnt a bit of English working on the ship for a year or so. And King said to them, look, would you like to stay on for a while and instruct the locals? It was a European settlement there, partly a prison colony, but other settlers as well. Would you like to instruct the settlers on how to process flax? Sure, they went about doing that. But King wrote down these 200 words in English, and then he got them to translate the words. He had to act out some of them, but and he had no idea about the spelling. Nothing had been established at this stage. Here's a section from his dictionary. So it's a fairly pedestrian inventory of words, but there's a glint of a very minor cultural epiphany that just flickers on that page if you look at it. You can go down, you can see there's husband, wife, and then you've got orphan. There's a blank next to orphan. Why? Well, because there were orphans in Norfolk Island, and King could point them out. They were the children whose parents had died and who are now in an orphanage, who were looked after, I think it was run by a church, and they were, in a sense, separated from the rest of the community and looked after by charity. Well, there wasn't an equivalent to that in New Zealand, because if your parents were dead, the whāngai system ensured that it would be an uncle or an aunt or a cousin or someone would take care of you. There's no idea of orphans as a separate group isolated from everyone else. And so King wasn't able to explain the concept, or he couldn't come up with, or rather his two Māori informants couldn't come up with a word that was the equivalent of that. And it just shows how little views and aspects of British culture had penetrated New Zealand at the late 18th, early 19th century. Another place where colonisation was gathering pace was in map making and naming. And by the early 19th century, there was a great rush of European names given to parts of New Zealand. And part of the reason for this was that it was very reassuring for potential colonists to come to a country where they were familiar with some of the names. It took away some of the trepidation of entering into an unknown place. Here's what the arch colonist himself, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, had to say about this. He said, names of places too should be changed. They make part of the moral atmosphere of the country. So very clearly there's an agenda here that we've got to change some of the names, and it becomes an act of displacement. For every English name that's applied, a name in te reo is shunted out of the maps. And that process only seems to go in one direction for most of the 19th century. But it wasn't all like this. It wasn't all a case of the British arriving like this fatal impact and the indigenous population simply collapsing in the face of this linguistic tidal wave. There were some parts of te reo and some parts of Māori culture that actually withstood that initial onslaught. And there's a very interesting account involving Captain Cook. Cook had died in the 18th century, but in the early 19th century, he was, in Britain anyway, extraordinarily famous. He was definitely placed very highly on that pantheon of great British explorers. What's interesting though, and that's well known, what's interesting is that in parts of New Zealand, Cook had a very high reputation as well among some Māori communities. Not because Europeans had said, this is a great explorer, but because they had their own personal experience of Cook. And so they developed their own histories about Cook. In 1827, when Augustus Earle was travelling through parts of Northland, he settled for about a month or so in the Bay of Islands. he struck a friendship with the Ngāti Manu chief Te Whareumu, whom he called King George in his journals. But Te Whareumu spoke reasonable English, and one of the great boasts the chief had is that his mother had seen Captain Cook, and that was a great source of pride for the chief. In 1835, Joel Pollock, the trader, travelled to Poverty Bay, and when he was there, he wrote down, and he was a reasonably fluent te reo speaker, he wrote down just a small section of an oral history about Cook. And here it is. He said, Cook's ship was first taken for a bird by the natives, but on seeing a smaller bird unfledged without sails descending into the water, and a number of coloured beings, apparently in the human shape, also descending, the bird was regarded as a houseful of divinities. Well, this metaphor of a bird with wings, sails, and a smaller bird, that's been used quite often. What's surprising about this is that this oral history was captured by Pollock and translated by him in the 1830s, by which stage there were words like, William Williams records the word kaipuke for a ship, that were in common use around parts of the coast of New Zealand in the 1830s. But what's interesting about this is that the people telling this oral history were so disciplined in that history that the language wasn't modified. It's rather like if we were to produce a history now of aviation in New Zealand before the First World War, and the book that we produced contained references not to aeroplanes, but to flying machines or flying contraptions. We wouldn't use that term because that belongs in that period, but would update our terminology as better words come into use, like aeroplane. But here, even though better words were available, the people who conveyed this oral history stuck strictly to the way it was told in 1769. And that's another of those little insights into how very disciplined this history was. And oral histories come in for criticism for being, well, it's a bit like gossip, or a bit like, someone adds a bit to it and they exaggerate it and so on. At times there are elements of that, but at times the way the stories are told are kept with great accuracy. The other significant point about this is this oral history was created by a Māori community. It was curated by them. They communicated it. They crafted it. It became part of the architecture of their history. So rather than what we normally expect, which is the British pushing their version of events onto Indigenous populations, here we've got the opposite, an Indigenous population claiming someone else's history as their own. It's almost as though they're colonising British history. But at the same time, there was still that view that people who didn't speak English were somehow inferior, and certainly Indigenous populations were extremely inferior. That goes right back to Joseph Banks, who described Māori as brutes. But here are some other examples. Okay, Māori described as beasts of the fields, wild animals, beastly, inhuman, savages, and barbarians. And what about te reo? Well, that wasn't much better. It was a language that was grunted, growled, roared, howled, and screeched, rather than spoken. These are all the sounds that animals make. And there's a very clear message. There is no value in this language because these are the characteristics of the language. These are the characteristics of the people who speak it. And you've got this fairly garish image here. The disturbing thing about this isn't an image from the 1830s, by the way. This is an image at the very end of the 1890s, almost into the 20th century. This is how the Indigenous culture was represented in this form. There was one group, though, that bucked the trend, and that was the missionaries. Contrary to what some people might imagine, for the first about 20 to 30 years of missionary activity in New Zealand, the missionaries didn't trample over te reo, but the opposite. They made every effort to learn it. And there's a reason for that, and it extends back to William Tyndale, who first translated the Bible into English. He was concerned that his argument was, I want the ploughboy to be able to understand the message of the Bible, and I want them to be able to understand it in his own language and make up his mind for himself about what it means. And that was very important to Tyndale, and so he set about translating the Bible into English. At the time, Bibles were available in most churches only in Latin, which excluded people from reading it and from understanding it and from having control of the knowledge. So Tyndale produced a translation, and he was thanked for that effort by being tortured and executed by the church. But the principle of having the Bible available in the language of people who wanted to read it was crucial, and that remained. And so very early on, missionaries arrived here in 1814. In 1815, there was a letter that was sent to one of the missionaries by Josiah Pratt, who was one of the secretaries of the Church Missionary Society, the organisation that ran the first mission in New Zealand. Here's an extract from it. This was sent on the, I think, 16th of August, 1815. So on Sunday will be 200 years ago exactly. He said, and it's quite instructive, "We shall hope to hear," this is what Pratt wrote to Kendall, "we shall hope to hear that you have made proficiency in the New Zealand tongue, and that the way will thus be prepared by you for the translation of the Scriptures. The New Zealanders will first learn the rudiments of their own tongue out of the Book of God." And that was the plan, and that was the plan that missionaries stuck with, that all the publishing they did in New Zealand, all the instruction they gave, not just religious instruction, but instruction in literacy, would all be conducted only in te reo. And they received increasing amount of criticism later on, especially in the 1840s, from some of the settlers. They said that you're retarding the development of the Māori community by not teaching them in English. Forget this language that they speak, they need to learn English. Kendall attempted to produce a textbook on the topic, and it was an idiosyncratic and inconsistent work. In fact, later on, shortly afterwards, in fact, Kendall himself acknowledged there were some quite significant deficiencies with it, but still it was a breakthrough in a way. But converting an oral language into a written one became one of the great revolutionary acts that affected te reo, and it affected it in a number of ways. One of them, I don't know how we measure this, but it's a very strong suspicion, it contributed to the standardization of the dialect. If we look at a te reo book now, yes, there might be slight dialectical variations depending on who's written it, but nothing like the situation that existed, say, in the 1840s, when a missionary in the south of the South Island ordered some textbooks for his Māori students, and when they arrived, he said they were useless because they were written in a Ngāpuhi dialect that had no meaning, that the children couldn't understand the words, a lot of the words that were used. In the 1840s, there was a missionary working around Mount Ruapehu, and he went to two communities separated by about 40 kilometres. And he noted, he's a very fluent speaker, he noted that the dialectical difference, just 40 kilometres apart, was substantial. So these are some of the challenges that existed with a language with many dialects and quite distinct dialects. Printing had the effect of, if you like, smoothing over the rough edges, of increasingly standardising those dialects. It also undermined the importance of committing information to memory. Why do you have to go through that whole wānanga process, the whole years and years of learning things when you can just write it down? It's there for you. You don't have to memorise it because it's right there. You can read it when you want. I think it also probably dented some efforts at oratory, because no matter how good you were at speaking, you couldn't beat an argument with a book. You could use all the techniques and weapons of oratory that you have, but the book's not going to answer back, and not a full stop or a word is going to change. So books were immune to conventional arguments, immune to pleas. They seemed to have almost a life of their own. And of course, they could mass produce information. Kendall decided in 1820, against instructions from his superiors, to go to England to produce a much more thorough dictionary. He took Hongi Hika and Waikato with him. And it was another one of these efforts that was well-meaning, but again, the results weren't as great as they could have been. What was lost? Well, we don't know. For example, was there an SH sound traditionally? Was there that sound in te reo? Well, some people say yes, some people say no. And for a long time, it swung towards the no's. There was no S, there was no SH sound. The problem is, if you look at the accounts of Europeans who travelled through New Zealand, say between 1815 and 1835, roughly, that 20-year period, many of them in certain parts of Northland, particularly the Bay of Islands and Hokianga, write words with SH in them. Did that exist? Well, how do we explain it? There are two explanations, and I think they're both wrong. The first explanation is that, well, they misheard it. And one person's argued this quite strongly. He said that Europeans misheard words, and so they wrote down an SH because they thought they heard it, but it wasn't actually said. Now, perhaps one or two might have misheard an SH sound, but the vast majority of them, it seems highly unlikely. On the balance of probability, you have to say that it's extremely unlikely that you hear a sound that isn't spoken. The other explanation that's been offered as well, the Europeans were simply following the conventions of writing that Kendall had established, and Kendall used the SH, so they all followed it. Well, that doesn't stack up either, because if they were following Kendall's conventions, how come they got so many other spellings wrong, but they still had this SH sound? Here are some examples for Hongi and for Hokianga. And you can see that SH, these are all from different writers, you can see that S, and there are many more, the SH sound is prominent in all of them. By the mid-19th century, though, certainly in most printed material, the SH has disappeared. And I talked about this issue with Erema Henare, in fact, just a week or so before he passed away. And he was telling me that in his grandparents' time, towards the beginning of the 20th century, it was still common in parts of Ngāti Hine to hear people use the SH sound. So it did exist. And it was a feature of te reo, but it disappeared from a lot of printed text around the middle of the 19th century, and gradually towards the end it became even scarcer. And it could be a case of printing knocking out the sound, that in the bid to have a standardized way of writing certain words, the SH sound disappeared because it was only perhaps something that occurred in a few small pockets in the country. In the 1840s and into the 1850s, things began to change again. There was a bigger European population in the country, and Europeans were pushing for English to be taught to Māori. They were opposed to the fact the missionaries were persisting in using te reo. But this is what the missionaries were doing during the 30s and into the 40s. This is the sort of output they were producing in te reo, and it's astonishing. I think the last figure in particular, 5.5 million pages of text printed in te reo by the end of 1840. So if that equates to books on a library shelf, that library shelf would be over 0.5 kilometre long. It's a staggering amount of production, and it still didn't meet demand. And then we get to the most famous act of translation in the 19th century, the treaty. And the treaty, of course, is regarded as a document that exists in English, inexpertly translated perhaps by Henry Williams. And many chiefs signed it, about 540 chiefs signed it. And there's been a couple of generations now of some extremely detailed, almost forensic analysis of the meaning of the text in English, the meaning of text in te reo, the issues of translation, and so on. But you could make the argument that, in a sense, looking at the text is one dimension of the argument, but there's another side of it, which is considering the treaty really as an oral agreement, because for many of the chiefs who signed it, the treaty was read out to them. And it was part of a wider explanation in some cases about what the text meant. So from the point of view of some of the signatories, yes, there was the treaty in terms of the text, but there was also the treaty in terms of the promises made by missionaries and officials or whoever was explaining it to them. So you could make the case, and I'm not going to labour this point at all, it's something for another time, but you could make the case that there are numerous treaties. Each hapu had their own treaty based on the explanation that was given to the chiefs. And the chiefs consented to the treaty not just based on the text, but also based on the explanations, the answers to their questions, and so on. So each hapu has potentially its own individual version of the treaty. And what we've found out recently is that those versions have survived and they've been transmitted down through the generations. And the Waitangi Tribunal in November last year produced a very interesting report which revealed these different interpretations. And it's having quite an impact on how people see the treaty. The government finally snapped. Its patience had run out with the missionaries. And it decided to take matters into its own hands. By 1858, the European population now outnumbered the Māori population for the first time in New Zealand's history. So within half a century, te reo had gone from being the only language in the country to a minority language in the country. And the government was keen on keeping this momentum going. Back in 1847, George Grey had issued the Education Ordinance, in which he did two things. Firstly, he took education out of the hands of the missionaries and put it in the hands of the state. So education was now state-controlled, and he insisted that instruction in the English language shall form a necessary part of the system. One settler at the time said, "This is crucial. We want to avoid the degradation of people being brought up as Maoris. We want to avoid that. So we have to teach them English." But by the 1850s, English had gone from being something that was being pushed to something that automatically seemed to become ingrained as one of the defining natures of the New Zealand state. That the New Zealand state, the government, the economic part of the state, by and large, was carried out in the language of English. In 1858, a government report argued that the native schools should now be regarded, the phrase was used, centres of civilisation. We're going to make the schools centres of civilization where English is taught. And here's what one politician had to say in 1858. Hugh Carleton. By the way, Hugh Carleton's father-in-law was Henry Williams, who translated the treaty. But in 1858, Carleton said this. He said, "I consider that too much stress cannot be laid upon the acquirement of the English language. I believe that civilization cannot be advanced through means of the Aboriginal tongue. It sufficed for the requirements of a barbarous race, but apparently would serve for little more." And in 1858, the same year, the Native Schools Act was passed. There was a requirement here that instruction in the English language and the ordinary subjects of the primary English education, industrial training shall form a necessary part of the system to be pursued in every school aided under this Act. There's a little implication there. If the school's going to get funding, this is how you teach in English. So you get the impression that New Zealand's split into two. There's the English-speaking community on the one hand by the 1850s, early 1860s, and then there's the Te Reo-speaking community on the other. But in actual fact, the boundaries between the two were much more porous than a general overview suggests. And there's a small example of this, and this leads to another very small but I think revolutionary development as well. In 1860, when conflict finally erupted in Taranaki over land purchases, the government didn't have enough troops to deal with this, so they decided to set up local militias, getting men in certain settlements to basically fight on behalf of the government. Problem was, not all of these men agreed. One of them, the Reverend Henry Brown from Taranaki, said, "No, I'm not going to fight. On the contrary, I support my Māori neighbours in what they're doing." And he communicated this to one of the local chiefs, and the chief said to him, "You and those men who are following you, I want you to do one thing, because there's going to be an attack at some point in the future. I want you to wear white scarves around your neck, and you'll be declared tapu because you've got those scarves on, and our troops won't attack you." Okay, so they did, and attack took place, and all those men who had supported Brown and not being prepared to fight their Māori neighbours, they weren't touched when the conflict broke out. What's interesting about this, I mean, it's a mildly important story, but this is much more interesting, I think, that these chiefs decided to communicate this instruction to the hapu and iwi, not by having a hui, but by putting these pānui around. They did it in writing, and this is one of the earliest examples where chiefs are communicating with their own people by putting notices up. And it tells us two things. Firstly, the importance of the written word, particularly in a time of crisis perhaps, is a bit more certain than trying to convene a hui. But also it tells us quite a bit about the extent of literacy that exists in the country among Māori communities. And by the late 1850s, there are some communities where Māori literacy rates in Te Reo anyway are much higher than European literacy rates in general. So it is a revolutionary development, but at the same time, the views of some Europeans towards Te Reo was becoming a bit more belligerent. These are typical of some of the comments. 40 years of civilization ought to have taught these people the value of an appearance of decency. But here's the problem, scraper Māori, and the savage shows distinctly underneath. The haka was described as an exhibition of the substratum of utter immorality, depravity and obscenity, which forms the groundwork of the character of the race. And this was precisely the sort of attitude that Te Reo was fighting against, and to be honest, it was losing against. There were other interesting responses to the intrusions of English in literacy, and some interesting marriages of convenience that took place. Another one of these revolutionary developments is the emergence of whakapapa books. James Carroll, at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, stressed to Māori communities, you have to produce these books, because in a generation or so, the people who have that knowledge might have already disappeared. The prognosis of the race was looking very grim at the end of the century. But in fact, whakapapa books date back to around the 1850s, because some Māori communities had already clicked onto this problem, that there may not be people in the future who are trained with all this knowledge, so we've got to preserve it. And over time, they evolved from being transcriptions of oral cultures in a way to substitutes for oral cultures. So they weren't so much transcribing what had happened in the past, and not just things to do with genealogy, but all sorts of other things to do with religion, history, boundaries, land, all sorts of other things that contained in these whakapapa books. They became substitutes for the oral culture. They became treasures in their own right. but they displaced the traditional processes in some instances of transferring information. Where the biggest impact, I think, on te reo occurred in the late 19th century was in demographics. And here are some statistics. 1840, European population, at the beginning of 1840, around 2,000, perhaps a bit less. Māori population, conservatively, 90,000, perhaps up to 100,000. What changes in 56 years? Well, the European population goes up to 743,000. That's a staggering growth. That's obviously through immigration, not birth rates. So the Māori population hasn't got the advantage of immigration to boost its numbers, so it has to rely on birth rates. So if it's 100,000 or so, well, that's not going to be particularly healthy over that period. If it remains static at 90,000, you know you've got problems. But what do you do when you've got this figure, 42,000? You know you're in real trouble then. What was the attitude of some Europeans towards this? How sympathetic were they? Well, here's one MP, Alfred Newman. He said, taking all things into consideration, the disappearance of the race is scarcely a subject for much regret. They are dying out in a quick, easy way and are being supplanted by a superior race. And the shocking thing about that is that it wasn't shocking. No one was particularly concerned or worried that this is some outrageous racist view. It was fitted in quite normally with a narrative of a lot of people. Here's what one newspaper editor described when he's dealing with a situation. The Māori know as well as we do the rate at which they are approaching extinction. Anything like an organised opposition on their part is out of the question. A little talk, a little negotiation, and every native difficulty will disappear like the morning mist. This dying race should be tenderly treated. We, the strong, able to crush, should be kind to our brave but vanquished race. And this has echoes of the famous quote from the 1850s, that the object of the government should be to smooth the pillow of the dying race. Don't prevent them from dying, but make it comfortable as they pass away. Of course, Māori society didn't need anyone else telling them how bad the situation was. Here's an image of Goldie. I know Goldie's seems perennially unfashionable, that people say, well, he wasn't painting in the style of the time. But I think this is a particularly important image because it captures that mournful mix of dread and despair that had descended on so many Māori communities at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. How grim did it get? There's one account, this hasn't been published, of a whānau from Tūhoe that had been, because of the scorched earth policy, had been pushed inland into some of the most rugged and inhospitable parts of the Uruwera forest. Very rocky, the soil was leached, high rainfall, craggy terrain, couldn't grow crops there at all, and they had no option but to live there, and they were gradually dying. When I say dying, there was a woman who gave birth over her life to 11 children. One of them reached the age of 5. 10 of them they had to bury before the age of 5 because there was this lingering malnutrition. And it got so bad that one evening, some of the kaumātua from this fairly large whānau decided to take matters into their own hands. And they walked off into the bush and committed suicide effectively. They just walked, middle of winter. Some of the bones were found in the 1950s. They'd curled up. Presumably they died of hypothermia. That was the only thing they could think of. The only thing they could think of to save the community was to kill themselves so there'd be enough food left for the next generation. That's how bleak it was. It's almost incomprehensible. At the same time, though, I think because the population, as far as just about everyone was concerned, was about to disappear, there's a slight shift in some Europeans' views of te reo. It's no longer something to be expunged. It's something that almost gets treated in a patronising way. A journalist who attended a tangi in 1889 wrote about the beautiful poems full of noble thoughts and dressed in the most expressive language that were recited in te reo by the mourners. The Auckland Star suggested that in the romantic legends of a dying race may be found inspiration enough for 100 Iliads. And James Cohen, the ethnologist and journalist, was talking about traditional Māori poems, as he called them. He said they were couched in the most beautiful language of expressive imagery, containing noble thoughts of a vanishing race. And this was part almost of a fashion at the end of the 19th century, a craving for things Māori. Not a deep understanding of it, but more an act, I think, of identity stripping. You even start to get houses that get given Māori names. Why? Because I think mainly it's a novelty, some novelty value. It's almost as though te reo is being treated as a piece of cultural bric-a-brac. It has some value, but after a while you can always dispose of it, and you're safely ensconced in English anyway, so there's no threat from it. Where the real advances in English were being made, though, was in schools. In 1879, the administration of the native schools transferred from the native department to the education department. And there was quite a different emphasis on schools from this point onwards. It became part of what we'd now call probably a mainstreaming exercise. And there's much greater control over the syllabus, what was taught, and also the language in schools. In 1880, James Pope was made Inspector of Māori schools and issued a native schools code, and this is one of the things it contains in it. He said, the aim of the teacher, however, should be to dispense with the use of Māori as soon as possible, so fitting them, the students, for becoming orderly and law-abiding citizens. A very strongly assimilationist approach. And I've always found this photo quite poignant. This is about 1899, 1900, from Hokorere Native School. And you look at these faces, and they look back at you from 115 years, and you know that they're having the language hammered out of them. You know that they're being told very clearly, you have to learn English because that's where your future lies. If you want a job, English is going to provide that for you. There is no further use for your language. And so in a way, it's a very poignant image, but it's also quite a tragic one. There were outcrops of te reo in settler society. In some branches of the Anglican Church, for example, I think in 1884, there was an ordination at St Mary's at Parnell here. And at that ordination, a Māori priest and a deacon were ordained. The whole service was conducted in te reo. Very interesting because conducted by a Pākehā priest in te reo. So there were still those a few exceptions in a way. There's one cleric, the Archdeacon of Waikato in 1897, said, I'm happy that so many Māori children learned the English language. However, do not be dismissive of your own language. But it was in Parliament, I think, where there's a very instructive example of what happens with te reo, because the first batch of Māori MPs, those who arrived there by the 1870, late 1860s, by 1870, most of them only spoke te reo. They didn't speak English at all. And some people looked at this and they said, that's fantastic. In the epicentre of colonial power in New Zealand, te reo was being spoken. What a great accomplishment. But if you read what those MPs say themselves about it, it had the opposite effect. It was a very marginalising experience. Here's what one had to say. It's beautifully put. We hear merely the words that are spoken, but we do not know the meaning. We are like a post standing, having neither voice nor ears. And it's a great metaphor for the frustration and the marginalisation they felt for speaking that language. What happens? By the 1890s, you get the next echelon of Māori MPs, and the electorates have voted. The Māori electorates have voted. Almost all of them speak English, as well as te reo. And they tend to speak English more often than not in the House. So the communities themselves felt the pressure of this marginalisation, and they responded not by making a stand for the language. They said, it's just not worth it. They responded by electing MPs who spoke English as well. So by the end of the 19th century, this mantra of the dying race was being trotted out all over the place. You can still see, go up One Tree Hill, you can still see mention of it there. It was commonplace. It wasn't a question of if the Māori population would disappear, but how long do we have to wait for it to happen? Surely any day now, any year now, there won't be any left. But in this very grim situation, there were a few flickers of optimism that shone through. In 1906, there was a Royal Commission, and one person who appeared before the Commission was Rewati Kohere, who was a clergyman and a journalist, a former student of Te Aute. He entered Te Aute, by the way, not being able to speak a word of English. And here's his very simple, but I think utterly compelling argument before the Royal Commission. I think if a boy is taught to despise his own mother tongue, we should not be surprised if he comes to despise his own mother. If you take away the racial pride from the Māori heart, the pride and traditions of his people, you lower his character. And so it's a very earnest plea, and I think it's a very fitting way to sum up the enduring importance of te reo. But why is all this history important at all? because one of the great criticisms of history is that, well, it's already happened, why do you worry about it? I think one of the answers to that is if you hope to recover the language, it's really important you first understand how it was lost. The particular stages by which it was lost may be instructive in trying to revive it. And hopefully I've given just a very brief overview of some of the ways in which the te reo began to lose its hold as a living language in the only country in the world where it's spoken. Looking back, I think you'd have to say that te reo's survival into the 20th century was one of the great escape acts of New Zealand history, because on paper it shouldn't have happened. On paper the language should have just naturally died out, but it didn't. And a whole lot of reasons for that in the early 20th century, but certainly I think the base for that was the very strong commitment that so many communities had to keeping their language. And I think for these reasons it's really important to remember all these aspects of history, and in doing so perhaps that's where some recovery can be effected. And I'd like to close with the words of Ali Wiesel, who was a Holocaust survivor, had been in a concentration camp, and for him the issues of language and culture and memory were literally matters of life and death. And here's what he said. He said, "Without memory there is no culture. Without memory there'd be no civilization, no society, and no future." Thanks very much.